towards a mutually beneficial and respectful partnership?
Pallavi, let's start with you. What do you think?
Thanks, Tony. Jasmine, I think I faced, a similar conundrum to you. I was of Indian parentage, but born in Australia and grew up there. And I've now moved back to Mumbai, where I live. And my whole life in Australia, I felt that I was defending being Indian. For me, specifically, it was Indian culture. I was an Indian classical dancer. And I found that no one really understood what it was that I did every 2 nights in a week. But I do think that things have changed in Australia, especially over the last 5 years. I think, unfortunately, what brought about the change was what happened in 2009, when I feel that there was a bit of misunderstanding between Australians and the incoming Indian students. But now, having gone back to Australia multiple times in the last 4 years, I feel an increase in communication occurring and, changes that are happening because the political elements of Australia are making an effort to create understanding about Indian culture in Australia that goes beyond the stereotype of curry and cricket. And having said that, in India, I found myself defending myself as an Australian. And, everyone thinks that Australia is made of racist bigots, but that's not the case. Australia is not a homogenous group of people. People are very multi-ethnic. I grew up with Greeks, Italians, Lebanese people, and I was always taught, despite some misunderstanding, to be proud of my Indian culture. So when I come here, I find myself being a real ambassador for Australia, but against some pressure. So it's a tough call, but I think things are improving.
Sashi Tharoor, what do you think?
Well, I think all stereotypes are essentially about people's superficial knowledge of each other. And the more you get to know people, the more those stereotypes get broken down into real people, real emotions, real feelings. I think what's interesting is that we have begun to discover Australia a lot more. The cricket field has certainly helped. But beyond that, there's been Bollywood discovering Australia, films being made there. And we find that Australians are discovering India. Again, the intermediary has been cricket, but we've seen Steve Waugh going off and working with unfortunate ill children in parts of our country. We've seen a greater engagement. And with that has come a lot more political engagement. I think 7 federal ministers and a whole clutch of state ministers have been to India in the last year from Australia. And certainly Indians have been traveling to Australia as well. The contact at the governmental level has been excellent, at least with the previous government, and I'm sure it will be with the new one as well. So as we get to know each other better, stereotypes tend to disappear.
Shashi, let me ask you this. Do you think the fact that so many Indians speak English means we've been a little bit lazy in Australia about learning about Indian culture?
Well, it's not that all of our culture is necessarily accessible through English. I mean, for Bollywood, of course, you don't need any language at all because our films are made to be understood whether or not you understand what's actually being said in the dialogue. They're sort of all larger than life. But I think it's partly distance, and partly Australia went through a phase of white Australia, there's no point denying that, during which Indians are by and large excluded, some who slipped through the net. And it's only really since the late 60s that Australia has embraced its own multiculturalism and thereby been interested in other Asian cultures. So I think to some degree that you have made a move from where you were, and we ourselves, frankly, I mean, we've had our sort of Eurasian community, the Anglo-Indians as we call them, migrating to Australia from a long time back. I had classmates in school who went off to Australia, one even played hockey for Australia, but thereafter, the Indian rediscovery of Australia is again a more recent phenomenon.
Let me put it to Karen. Do you think about Australia at all? Do you have any kind of engagement with the Australian culture or Australian politics?
You know, your question is a provocative one. Do I think about Australia at all? The honest answer is most of the time, I'm afraid I don't think about Australia. My contact with the outside world has really been on the other side of the planet with England, where I studied. But increasingly in the last 2 years, I've visited your country. I've grown to know it a little. I can't say I understand it completely. I've grown to like it enormously, and I've begun to realize something else. That just as the stereotypes that applied in England to Indians in that country in the 70s when I first went there have broken down substantially and changed, so too with time, understanding and an increasing interchange of people, the same will happen in Australia. And if you look back, 4 years ago, there was a crisis in India when it seemed that Australia was turning racist, you were attacking Indian students, and there was an enormous outrage in the Indian press. It transpired on investigation that some of the instances and incidents that had been brought up and were thought the most horrific actually were things that Indians were doing to themselves. And it was misunderstood by us. That issue has completely disappeared. No one today, when they talk about Australia, would actually bring that to the forefront. It is true that Australia is still thought of by most Indians in terms of kangaroos and cricket. But the great outdoor, the terrific holiday opportunity that you offer, uranium is something that we badly need. The increasing tourism between the two is going to, over a period of time, break down the stereotypes and lead to greater understanding and students. And 10 years down the road, the position and the way in which you think of Indians and we think of Australians will be more similar to what has happened to Indians in England today.
Let's hear from Sherma. What do you think? And the question really was about mutual stereotyping, wasn't it? I mean, do you think both sides are guilty of this?
Well, certainly I am guilty of it, because when I think of Australians, I do think of them being racists, and that's not just because of what they've done to Indian students, you know, which is the kind of media focus that we brought to it in India. But also I think of what Australians have done to their own Aboriginal communities, and the fact that today the big political discourse is about the boat people and how Australians are absolutely catatonic with hysteria about letting in boat people into this country, which is made essentially of boat people, you know. And the fact that this is an immigrant country that's been, you know, that's been made out of people fleeing their own home countries, but is so hostile to others coming in now, does make me feel that
I'm going to have to throw that to Stuart McGill as an Australian representative of the panel.
And I have to say that I'm somebody, perhaps the only person on this panel, who absolutely doesn't watch cricket, but I do know from the kind of surround sound that when an Australian team is playing Indian team, that there's usually a kind of hostility that is not true of other teams.
Well, he's a leg spinner, if that means anything to you, but we don't expect political spin from him.
Absolutely not. And I think Tony's probably thrown to me because he heard me sort of giggling behind his show. I'm very, very sorry. The big thing for me is that I, unfortunately, like a lot of Australians, have found politicians certainly focusing a lot on, you know, people arriving in Australia by illegal means. But certainly my friends, you know, I live in Sydney, big city in Australia, not the biggest comparatively, of course, around the world, but we don't concern ourselves about that. We do have very, very strong feelings about human rights. We do welcome people from all races, because it's not just, you know, cricket, kangaroos and uranium, as I've found out. We love our food, wine and cross-pollination of cultures as well. So I think it's definitely been a political issue, but maybe not a real issue.
Let's hear from Schwapan in the middle there.
Well, you know, it's very easy to get very indignant about certain perceived ills, and I think no country in any sense is perfect. And Australia, I think, and I really discovered Australia 2 years ago when I first went there. It's my only visit. And the first thing that struck me about Australia was how large it was. And it's a sense that you don't get when you look at the map and you look at one sort of landmass tucked away somewhere in the corner. It's huge. And given the fact that it's huge and the fact that it's so diverse, you go to Sydney or you go to Melbourne, the two cities I've visited, and I found they could be as cosmopolitan as anywhere else. Therefore, to go on and on harping about Australia and have a sort of what I think one of your former prime ministers, John Howard, used to call the black band theory of history, you know, constantly apologizing for ills, etc. I think it's beyond that. I think there's a
he would probably, John Howard, probably accuse Sherma of that.
Yes, I think, well, I think that's quite true. You know, John Howard would sort of think of Sherma as one of those who would be responsible for the ills of the world, if not Australia.
We're going to let Sherma respond to that.
Yeah, no, you asked me if there is a stereotype, and I said, yes, there's a stereotype.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily what I personally feel, the entire spectrum of what I feel about Australia. I mean, I haven't visited, not as fortunate as Swapan, but I've just visited Sydney. And yes, the physical beauty of the place strikes you, the cosmopolitanism of the city strikes you. And as I said, this is a country that's absolutely made by people coming from the different corners of the globe. But as much as I would require of us to be self-reflective, I'm sure Australians themselves want to be self-reflective of their ills, and that we don't need to put a diplomatic bandage over that.
I'm sure that is true. This is Q&A. It's live from India. We've been working with oursay.org and Graham Varney to recruit questioners from rural and regional India. Our next question is from Sonia from Terry in Uttarakhand in the north of India. She sent her question as a voicemail.
नमस्कार, मेरा नाम सोनी है और मैं आपसे पूछना चाहूँगी कि जो ऑस्ट्रेलिया में जो हमारे भारतीय छात्र हैं यानी कि विद्यार्थी हैं, उनके लिए आपने क्या सुरक्षा वहाँ पे रखी है, उनके लिए क्या नियम आपने वहाँ पे लागू किए हैं? धन्यवाद।
Right, well, so for our English speakers, Sonia asked, what has been done to protect the safety of Indian students in Australia? It's an important question. Pallavi, what do you say?
I'm always first, aren't I, Tony? Look, I think that there was definitely a racket going on as far as the way education was being sold to Indians a few years ago. And I think one of the important things to recognise is that Indian students were considered commodities. Education was considered an export. And we were losing out on the human element of the fact that these are Indian people coming to live in our country. And I think that since then, and at the time, as Mr. Thapar said, that perhaps the Indian media did sensationalise slightly what was happening in Australia, but it brought to attention the fact that Indian students were disgruntled about the level of education they were receiving, about the attitudes of some of the local people. And since then, I've gone back and seen an increase in communication. I've seen cultural events being put on by the government of Victoria specifically because I'm from Melbourne. I've seen dialogue happening on a community level, people getting together, expressing what Diwali is about. And I know those things seem tokenistic at first glance, but I think that's the start of increased communication. And over the years, my parents have been in Australia for 30 years. I was born there, and I think it's been an incredibly open place. If you want to communicate and talk about your culture, that's a very welcome thing.
Sashi, what do you think? Does the government here believe that that episode is now behind us, really?
Oh yes, no, in fact, even at the time we thought that the media here was getting a little hysterical unnecessarily about it. There were incidents, we were concerned, our embassy and our consulates were reacting on the spot, working with the state authorities, the local police, community organizations. But in terms of absolute numbers, I think there were a grand total of 23 incidents, of which 7 involved serious injury. And I think Australian diplomats were arguing that there were probably as many incidents in the same period of time involving Australian tourists in India that didn't get a fraction of the media attention. But the Indian government was anxious that the Australian government show themselves to be responsive, show themselves to be conscious that there is a problem and that they are taking action, and they did. And I think that after a while, the media vultures moved on to the next prey, and Australia's, it lost a lot of Indian students for a year or two, and then it slowly started climbing back up again.
And yet we hear, obviously, from regional India, there's still concerns out there, but one of the interesting things, of course, is that the largest group of people migrating to Australia now are Indians.
Well, I mean, I was Minister of State for External Affairs when all this was happening, and I got lots of very anxious student delegations, student unions, parents groups coming and saying, why isn't the government doing more to bash Australia on the head in return? And our answer was, look, we're engaging with them, they're taking this seriously. I must say, Australia responded very well. They sent a lot of ministers to India to explain what they were doing. The then Deputy Prime Minister, later Prime Minister Julia Gillard was one of them. There was a serious attempt made to show India that Australia was not what these media stereotypes were suggesting.
Let's hear from Stuart on this.
At the time, I'm a member of the Sydney University Cricket Club, and at the time, one of the first grade members at our club was an Indian student, Kevin Desai. And I remember discussing with all of the guys at Sydney Uni, because unfortunately, whilst I was playing cricket there, I wasn't a student. That's beyond me. But I was concerned that we were being misrepresented internationally. And it warms me to hear that universities all over Australia are considering that Indian students would be not just of a financial value to their university communities, but it makes it a richer place. I'm glad to hear that everybody's still coming back.
It is a rich place. Stuart, do you think that our cricket team, whilst supposedly great ambassadors for Australia in India, is not really representing Australia in one respect, and that is it's a very Anglo-centric team. There aren't many. There's not much evidence in that team of cultural diversity.
Well, of course, recently we've had a player of Pakistani descent, Fawad Ahmed, playing for Australia, making his debut for Australia.
An Indian who's played for Australia, Sandhu.
Sandhu, exactly. And also Stuart Clark, who recently played for Australia. His family is actually of Indian descent. There are a lot more players around just beneath the surface that you probably haven't heard of yet. Expect to see a great deal more in the future.
May I just add in? I think it's going to be a very, very sad day for cricket if we're going to assess cricket team in terms of its ethnic composition.
That's true. I have actually seen that case made by a study in Australia, which is why I made the
Yeah.
point. Let's go to another question, which is actually about cricket, more specifically about Sachin Tendulkar. It's from Pavan Gantok.
My question is actually as much about Sachin Tendulkar as about India's relevance to the world, because there's been a fascinating parallel over the past 20 years in the coincidence of the emergence of India on the world stage and Sachin's reign in cricket. But the question is that now that he's retired, what does the future foretell for not only the Indian cricket team, but equally for India's relevance on the global stage? Do the panelists think that there is a next peak to be scaled, or is there a situation of a slow but steady, inevitable decline from where we are here?
Right, let's start with Sachin, because you've actually written about this. You've written about Tendulkar's rise coming with the rise of India.
I have indeed, and it's true. You know, India was, when Sachin made his debut, still a fairly protected economy, growing at the fabled Hindu rate of growth at 3%. It was still marginal to most world discussions of economic might and so on. And then, as Sachin rose, India rose, and we had Sachin, the icon of the newly emerging India. Now Sachin's career is over, India has emerged, and a man who taught India that we could actually be the world's best at something, that we could have the world's best at something, is leaving at a time when winning is the new normal, where he's left behind a bunch of young players who frankly are striding the cricket field with a swagger that might not have been conceivable at the time that Sachin Tendulkar made his debut. So in some ways he's perfectly captured this emergence of Indian confidence. And one last thought is the economics. I mean, you know, we've gone from being relatively unimportant in international cricketing circles to being the gorilla on the beach. We have 90% of the cricket world's revenues come from India because of Indian television audiences. And India displaces, as a friend of mine put it, as much weight on the International Cricket Council as America does in the UN Security Council.
Yeah, indeed.
So
let's talk for a moment about Sachin Tendulkar. Anyone who's been here, as I have over the past few days, watching the kind of reverence for this man, that it's almost godlike. He's sort of like a demigod here. You've actually written that you think he could make use of that. He's been made a member of Parliament. He's been appointed to the Parliament effectively, but you believe he might end up or could use that position as a sort of bully pulpit.
He could if he wanted to. Everyone says that his nature is not such that he's likely to be tempted to do that, but he has enormous moral authority, and any issue on which he chooses to intervene, people will listen to him. There's no question. As somebody who's occupied so much mind space and heart space in the Indian imagination for 24 years, if he opens his mouth on a matter of public interest, I'm sure we'll all listen. Whether we agree or not, whether some agree or not, he will get a hearing. He will be able to weigh in a way that very few people will be able to in a compromise.
Let's hear from Karen on that. I mean, do you think it's even conceivable that he would use that kind of power in a political way?
I doubt if he'd use it in a political way, because my instinct tells me he deliberately avoids political controversies, and to use power in a political way is to invite controversy upon yourself, and I think he will seek to avoid that. But he will certainly use it to promote causes that are close to him: sports training, provision of sports facilities. He will certainly use it perhaps on moral issues where someone like Sachin's voice, whether it's on the treatment of women, whether it's on upliftment of deprived classes, whether it's on provision of healthcare or education for those who don't have it, there I think his voice will be heard, because I think those are issues that he will feel he can raise beneficially without entering controversy. But I suspect he will avoid controversy at all costs.
I'll go to Stuart. I'll come to you in a second. Stuart's sort of jumping around there.
Tony,
he wants to make
look,
some comment.
I think that one of the reasons that Sachin was such a big deal to Indian people in a cricketing sense is because everybody here remembers him as a schoolboy. He started playing cricket the way that everybody in this country started playing cricket. He was making hundreds, I might add, at that time, and very shortly after was playing for India. But he has straddled the period of time when India has become, in cricketing terms, the economic superpower. What I would love to see him doing post-cricket is I would love to see him I guess, recapturing the hearts and minds of the kids who are playing in the sandlots, behind our hotels, out on the streets. Cricket shouldn't be just a game for the wealthy. It shouldn't just be about IPL franchises. I would love to see Sachin now decide that one of the things that's closest to his heart is those little boys that are out there playing, boys and girls out there playing cricket, because it's a game for the people.
Well, another great subcontinental player, Imran Khan, actually has gone into politics in Pakistan. Could you even imagine that happening with Sachin Tendulkar?
Well, Imran was very, very comfortable being a captain, of course, and leading movements right from a very early age. As my fellow panellists have said, it appears evident that Sachin likes to calm the waters, behind the stage, if you like.
Let's hear from Shoma on this. You were going to jump in before, and I know that you're not a cricket fan, but you must be aware, obviously, of his almost godlike reverence for
I am,
Sachin Tendulkar.
and I have to say that, what Sachin is on the field is godlike, as you said, but in public life, I think and a lot of our public icons, given the amount of adulation they get, are extremely disappointing as public figures. And I don't expect Sachin to go into politics at all. It's not part of his temperament. But I'd be extremely...
He already has a seat in Parliament.
Yeah, but I'd be extremely, extremely taken aback and pleasantly taken aback if he espouses even two of the causes that Karan has spoken of. Because the fact is that he has never used his preeminent position to speak up on any issue in this country. And I don't mean that it has to be any controversial political issue. He has not used his eminence for anything, and not even for sport. So as I said, I would be very pleasantly taken aback if he does that. And I'd be very pleasantly taken aback if many public figures in our country who are adulated like gods, I would name Amitabh Bachchan as one of them, who would use that eminence for anything. But so far, we've not had the Muhammad Ali kind of public figure in our country.
Tony, there's an interesting contrast you could draw between Imran Khan and Sachin. If you recall, when he won the World Cup in Australia in '92, Imran delivered a speech that became instantly controversial both in Pakistan and with his team there on the field, because he forgot to thank them. Yes. He spoke purely about his personal ambition, which was to build a hospital for cancer in his mother's name. Sachin, in contrast, when he delivered a speech which he said hadn't even been scripted or thought of, made a point of thanking practically everyone who had featured in his life. Not just his family members, not just his children, but his coach, his team, and others who had played a role. And that, I think, is an important distinction to draw. Sachin is very conscious of what he needs to return and what he owes. At least that's the impression he's given me as an outsider. Yeah. Imran, on the other hand, is a man who's determined about what he needs to do and how he's going to get there, but quite happy to forget those who've helped him to get to that position.
Let's hear from
Unfortunately, he didn't pay the taxes on one of his luxury cars. I think that says something about Sachin.
There's the one fascinating thing which marks the rise of Sachin, and I'll take off from where Shashi left off. I think to a very large extent, the boom in Indian cricket also corresponded with what I may call the Australianization of Indian cricket. It became far more aggressive, it became far more competitive, and we abandoned the sort of game of the lordly amateur, which was what the game in the 60s and the 50s was all about. Now, what that has had two consequences. One, it certainly made cricket very, very appealing as a way of life to those kids who want to get onto the IPL bandwagon, etc. But at the same time, it's ended cricket, the lovely amateur game, which a lot of people enjoyed it. And I think that's one of the not very desirable consequences of Australianization.
I'm going to interrupt. That's exactly what I was actually saying. I completely agree with you, and I hope we can reclaim that to some degree.
Stuart, I'm going to interrupt you because we've got one more question on cricket. This one is from Rajesh Katana, and I'm sure Stuart will want to respond to this.
When we come to the greatest batsman of the world, Sachin Tendulkar or Don Bradman. So please tell me who is the greatest between of them?
Stuart McGill, who's the greatest, Don Bradman or Sachin Tendulkar?
Don Bradman or Sachin Tendulkar. I think it would be unfair of me to comment on Don's prowess, considering I wasn't alive when he played. However, I think historically, there's certainly had the same expectations placed on them by the weight of society. Don Bradman did a lot to improve people's, I guess, self-esteem and the way they looked at their nation at a time in Australia when we really needed it. And, you know, we've heard from the Minister that that's much the same of Sachin here, Rajesh, and I hope that post-cricket, Sachin enjoys a very successful post-cricketing career in a way that takes him to new and exciting places, and maybe he can inspire India again in a completely different area.
Stuart, just briefly, who was then, to put it another way, who is the greatest batsman you ever bowled against? Because you did bowl against Tendulkar.
Okay. Yes, well, look, I did get to bowl to Sachin. In 2003, I played against India in Australia. Just for political sake, the series was 2-2. We decided to do that just for Q&A tonight, way back then. I bowled to Sachin in Adelaide and fortunately picked him up, so I got Sachin Tendulkar out once. He did repay the favour a couple of tests later with 241 not out. Note to self, never get Sachin Tendulkar out, it doesn't pay. But I'm now, Tony, on the trust at the SCG. Sachin Tendulkar is the first overseas player to ever be granted honorary life membership of the SCG, and it was probably because of me, because of my bowling.
You did see that he hasn't answered the question.
He hasn't answered the question.
The best bowler, the best batsman I bowled to, the most difficult batsman to get out was probably Sachin Tendulkar. But I apologise, India, if you're a spin bowler, the person you don't want to be bowling to is either Brian Lara or Lakshman.
Okay, well, it is time to move along. We'll leave that one hanging in the air. You might get lynched on your way out. You're watching Q&A live from India. Our next question comes from Bharti Yadav.
Hi, good evening to everyone. Being an Indian girl, the issue of increasing number of rapes is really panicking from me, for myself. And not for me, for each girl, for each Indian girl. The number of rapes, they are increasing tremendously, contrary to traditional India, where this issue was very rare and was serious. So what, according to you, have contributed to this increasing trend?
Okay, we'll start with Sharma.
Well, Bharti, I don't think that rape is on the increase. What is on the increase is that women are speaking out, and I think that that's a really positive thing. We are an extremely misogynistic society, though we don't see it like that. You know, from the moment of birth to moment of death, a woman has many more impediments to her life cycle than a man does. You know, from the very hurdle of being born, we have the largest feticide numbers that you can think of anywhere in the world. And you know, you go through the whole thing, the dowry, the acid attacks, discrimination in terms of whether you get to school or you don't get to school, higher levels of malnutrition, you name it. And the only thing I say about India, we do a lot of journalism based on women's issues, is that everything you say about India, the opposite is also true. And it is extremely fortunate for many women to be born in India because you have many opportunities, you have many freedoms. But by and large, I would say we are an extremely misogynistic society. And I think it's a misconception that traditional Indian society was more liberal or more just where women were concerned. That's absolutely not true. What we suffered under was a conspiracy of silence, and women are speaking up now, the media is more focused on it, and that's why you have a sense of increase. But even as I say this, I think for me personally, both as a woman and a journalist, the best sign is that in unrecorded ways, I think there are little rebellions going on in every family, in every alleyway, in rural India, in little towns, in big cities. And nor is this violence the domain of the poor and not of the rich. It cuts across class, gender, religion. And what you do have is a million rebellions going on where women are asserting themselves and their autonomy over their own body. And I think that's what's going to change India. So,
Pallavi.
Sharma, I agree 100% with you. I think in the time that I've lived in India, what I've seen most blatantly is this notion of shame and blame, that women feel very reluctant to talk about the fact that they've been victimized in this way or they've been assaulted sexually. And what I've seen is the rise of intrafamilial sexual assault as well, which is very disturbing because sexuality is repressed in this country to a very large degree. People cannot express themselves. Women find it very difficult to find self-determination. They always have to be robed a certain way. There's this attempt to modernize in urban centres vis-a-vis this attempt to maintain tradition. And they're left in no man's land. It's very, very difficult. So I think, the fact that India has risen out of apathy in the last 1 year, or at least I've seen that change, is a positive sign. But we need to just concentrate on giving women the confidence to report as much as they can.
Before we go on to the other panellists, we've got a web question specifically for you from Anand Guru Rajan from Oakley in Victoria. Bollywood films are well known for the sexualisation of women, and I'm wondering whether Pallavi could comment on the link between this and the increased level of abuse of women in India.
That's an argument that's been made many times, and I know that Bollywood is known to objectify women. There's a notion of an item number where a woman might be scantily clad, dancing away and trying to tantalise the men around her. And I think Shoma's written about this. It's the notion of the goddess or the slut. And sometimes what is trying to be projected is this notion of a devi or a goddess, but it's being translated in a different way. So there's a line there that's being traversed all the time. And it's often giving license to many people to be voyeuristic in relation to women. And that's something I think it's a responsibility of an actor or a performer to be careful about.
Tony, may I just say something here? I think this issue about Bollywood is really important because it's not that cinema has to always be politically correct. It's not that, as many have argued, that all dances and all sexual scenes. In fact, there's even a move now that no rape or no violence against women should be shown in Indian cinema. And I would be horrified if we were to infantilize ourselves in that way. So I don't think that you have to censor this. I think the onus of it lies in the director's eye, in the way the camera presents these things. And so it's not that you shouldn't have this, it's not that you shouldn't have dancing, it's not that you shouldn't have titillation, but that the director's eye and his moral voice or her moral voice should be very clear. It should be presented as something that you don't necessarily want to emulate, whereas right now, Hindi cinema presents titillation and eve-teasing as being what women live to, live for.
What is eve-teasing? Is not a concept we'll be familiar with.
Well, eve-teasing is a very old-fashioned word. It is to basically say that women present themselves for male, cheap male teasing, and that they're quite happy to walk down a street, and a man whose attentions they don't want will lavish the woman with that attention, and ultimately at the end of the film she and he will get together, so it kind of legitimizes an unwanted attention from the man on the street. And I'm saying all of that is part of our society, and it should certainly be part of our cinema. What right now is really dubious is the way in which the camera and the director's eye works itself out in our cinema.
Let's hear from Karen down the end. And what is the responsibility for men here, particularly in the way they bring up their sons?
Absolutely. And I think there's an aspect of rape in India that's either overlooked and worse still quite often ignored, and that is the simple fact that rape happens because men rape. And I don't mean that to be simply a glib statement of fact. What I'm trying to suggest is the way in which we bring up our men, our boys. We inculcate in them from childhood the belief that boys are gods, and we bring them up as little princes, at the same time as treating their sisters as if they're a curse. And it is the attitudes that are engendered from childhood that work their way through teenage, into young adulthood, into maturity, that give men the belief that women are a commodity, that they are a plaything, that they are there as sexual objects, that somehow the family will understand. And you have corroborative attitudes that come from mothers and aunts and grandmothers who say to their daughters, you mustn't go out, you mustn't dress like that, you're exciting the attention of boys. That attitude needs to change, and it needs to begin with the way we bring up our young boys. And the truth is, Indian mothers, grandmothers in particular, but often sisters and wives, are responsible for the fact that they engender in their little young boys an attitude of difference and superiority, if not being better. And that's the root cause of the problem.
Let me throw that to Sashi. Were you brought up as a princeling, effectively?
No, actually I had two sisters and I was brought up to feel responsible for them. So I think it'll vary from family to family. I'm not disagreeing fundamentally with Karan's point that in traditional society there has been a privileging of the male child over the female. The male child is fed first in many families before the girls are, and that sort of thing. And very often the boy is the one who's given a good education and so on. And the girls, well, it doesn't matter if they're in school. I mean, that's very often the case particularly in rural India, small town India, old-fashioned India. But that is changing, and I think certainly Bollywood and other images of empowered women have certainly helped bring about that change. I don't want to repeat what everyone said. I agree completely with Shoma that it's not that more rapes are happening, it's we're more aware of them now. We didn't know about them before. Now people are talking. There's a free media that's publicizing it. It's become an important issue, and certainly the mass media, which in the past got away with a lot of, frankly, unattractive depictions of women being harassed, there's no other word for it, and yet succumbing in the end to their harassers. I think they're much more conscious now, and they're also depicting women differently, though the item numbers have got much worse than they used to be. Now, having said all of that, the key thing also is response. Bharti asked about how young girls in India are feeling unsafe, and that's something I'm genuinely concerned about as an elected representative. When we had the horrific rape in Delhi, I was in my constituency in Thiruvananthapuram when all the protests erupted here, and there, as far away from Delhi as you can fly without falling into the water, there were young people lighting candles in our martyrs statue, and I talked to them, and I discovered that the girls there are equally concerned about can they be safe in our country after dark and all of that. There's now a great consciousness of this. Certainly there are more girls out there on their own after dark or with male friends, who therefore feel that vulnerability and therefore need that protection. And I think we've been slow, not just as a society, but as a state, to respond to this need. We don't have enough police patrolling, we don't have enough mobile patrols in certain areas, we don't have enough rape counseling in crisis centers. There's a lot more the state could be doing to augment the sense of security that every Indian citizen, every Indian woman citizen is entitled to.
Okay, I'm going to move on because we're...
wanted to make one point because
comment.
There's such a sense that rape happens outside and it's after dark, and when you step out, I'd just like to put a really horrifying statistic that 90% of rapes and sexual assault in this country happens within the family or by people that you know, and most of it goes unreported. So this really is something that we need to fix societally. Of course, the state must have better response mechanisms, but rape happens within the home and within your known environment rather than when you step out into the dark.
But having said that, I think it's important to point out that the status of women in India in the past 50 or 75 years has improved exponentially, far more than any other society. And compared to where we were, say in 1947, to where we are now, I think that is a cause of achievement, and we should also celebrate that.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you because we've got quite a few questions to get through, and some of them are really important ones. This one in particular is from Dr. Ushvinder Pople.
I would like to say that India is a country with a lot of economic growth and development. And to be effective, this growth and development should percolate to the masses, and its gain should be translated to the masses. But we are not seeing that kind of percolation till the grassroots level. What would the panelists say that why we have not been able to achieve with so much of growth and development, why are we not able to reach it to the people at large?
It's the equity question, Shoma.
Yes, Ushvinder, I really thank you for that question. It's certainly something that upsets me and engages me hugely. I think partly it's a huge design defect, and it is immaterial whether the BJP or the Congress rules at the center or indeed a third front, because there's absolutely nothing to choose between their economic policies. So far there's been this sense that there will be a trickle down. Certainly we are the beneficiaries of the economic wealth of the last 20 years that's been created, but there has been it's been jobless growth. We've created 30 million jobs in 20 years. And the amount of outrage that there is today over welfare spending, you call it welfare spending, I call it investment, because we keep speaking of the demographic dividend, but actually they are almost, you can argue over the percentages, but 70-80% of India does not have access to healthcare, to education, to drinking water, to basic medical facilities, and definitely not to jobs.
Shoma,
and the one thing I'd like to say is that
I want you to say more, actually, but I want to interrupt you just to say this. In 2012, you went with a team of economists to Uttar Pradesh, where you saw terrible poverty, and partly in response to that, we've seen in India a couple of months ago the Food Security Bill, which is basically a bill passed to try and give more food to people who are malnourished and in many cases suffering as a result of that. But the reaction from elites and economic elites and others in India was intensely negative to this move. Tell us why.
Yeah, I think it's shocking because people feel that this is, it's harming the fiscal deficit. People feel that this is profligate spending. They feel that if you bring food to these people, that they're going to become so lazy that they're going to stop working. Because of course, material aspiration and the desire to move is only the preserve of the elite, and that if the poor get their basic 2 meals a day, that they're not going to want to put shoes on their children's feet, they're not going to want to get them education, they're not going to want them better jobs. And there are economists and national media who feel that just putting food onto people's tables is going to make us a lazy people. And I think that that's completely wrong, because what we are right now speaking of is not perpetuating this, but of bringing people onto a basic platform of human dignity from which entrepreneurship can begin. We're also talking about multi-tracked approach to our economy. We're not saying stop industrialization, we're not saying stop manufacturing, but you are saying that if people do not have basic access, how can they become entrepreneurs? How can you speak of demographic dividend when basically what you're creating, in the next 10 years, we're going to have 480 million people join the workforce. Forget about the fact that we're not creating jobs for them. They are going to be unemployable. Because when you are malnutritioned and when you don't get nutrition in your mother's womb, then you are intellectually, emotionally, and physically stunted. And if you speak to anybody now, we have actually a workforce crisis in this country entirely because of the short-sightedness of our governments. And I don't think that the two, one keeps then being seen as left or center or as socialist. I think we're in a beautiful place in India's history when high capitalism and socialism can go together by dropping the isms. We need a middle ground.
I need to hear from other panelists, and I'll go to... I'll go over to someone who arguably comes from the right. Now, I'd like to ask you whether you think that this idea that the markets were food poisoned as a result of this bill has any currency.
I think, that there's one way of trying to guilt trip the whole of India by saying that anyone who opposed the food security bill actually wanted people in poverty because they felt that if they ate, they would become lazy. Now, that's a wonderful type of stereotyping which is done in order. The whole point is, at present, we have to look at how much can we afford. It would be ideal if we can create a mini Sweden within India, have about 80% taxes also along with it. It would be ideal if everyone could get unemployment benefit if they don't have a job. But unfortunately, money does not grow on trees. We have to work with the limited resources. What has happened in the past few years is that a considerable amount of resources has been taken away from investment in infrastructure and education and has actually been moved into areas of welfare spending where less than 40% probably reaches the intended beneficiaries. So rather than create the environment in which growth is possible, we've created a bloated state. Now, if we want a bloated state, I think we are fully entitled to create one.
But can I just interrupt you there? Can you actually afford not to feed people who are malnourished?
Of course not.
Yeah.
I think today the objections were that these are schemes which are best done at a local level. These are schemes which are not done at a one-size-fits-all thing, that a scheme which is meant for the northeast of India is not necessarily applicable for for Shashi's constituency in southern India. So there is a diversity of India, there is a lot of local planning.
Sharma wants to get in briefly.
I need to look to your right and not let the conversation be dominated by the left, not just physically, but ideologically as well. And it's not that I actually intending to put in an ideological right-wing viewpoint, but the question that was asked and that triggered off this discussion was, why is the development policy of successive governments not actually trickling down to people to improve their lives? And the answer is partly what Shoma has talked about, but largely it's to do with something else. What you need is a policy that generates entrepreneurship, which creates employment. Those are not things that government can do by fiat or diktat. Those are things that are done by creating an environment that encourages investors to want to put their money to create jobs. There are restrictive laws and policies that need to be revoked. For instance, we run a regime where unionization ensures that the 7% in unions have a labor policy that disallows the 98% outside unions getting easy jobs. You need to have a relaxation of the labor labor law market so that entrepreneurs feel free to set up a company. At the moment, if you set up a company and you're employing over 100 and it fails, you are stuck with your employees even if your company has collapsed, which is a great deterrent against.
Okay, I'm going to ask for brief answers from everybody.
Yes.
I'll bring you back in.
Shoma, you have to let other people speak because there are two other panelists who want to be heard as well.
I really do.
Sashi wants to get in on this, and then I'll come to you, I promise. Okay, Sashi.
Now, the fact is I come down somewhere in the middle of this conversation because the truth is that Shoma is right that there still is awful poverty, iniquity, some malnourishment, all of that. But it is also true that we have made some real progress. In the last 10 years, we have pulled 138 million people out of poverty. There are now more children in school than ever before. There is progress being made, and we Indians are very good at criticizing ourselves. But the fact is that while our population has grown, the number of poor people in the country has shrunk. And that is an indication that some things are working. Some of the benefits of our economic growth and development are reaching where they should. As for the social safety net, obviously I am part of the government and the ruling party that voted for the food security bill. So I will disagree with Chopin to the extent that I do believe that we need to do this. We need to ensure that at least everybody in this country has the basic grains they need to eat before they don't want to go to bed hungry. We have to ensure that they don't. But having said that, in our country, some states already have even more far-reaching schemes. So to that degree, Chopin is right. It's not one size fits all. In my state of Kerala, the government is already giving rice at ₹1 a kilo. The central government is offering it at 3. So there are variations in any case within the country.
Okay, brief answers
people.
is what I'm calling for. And,
well, there have been benefits.
A very brief response.
It is not hopeless.
Yes, okay.
Very brief. I absolutely agree with Swapan on there should be no one size fits all. I disagree when he says, can we afford the food bill? Because we give 5 trillion in tax evasions to companies in this country. If we can afford that, we can afford one lakh.
It's not tax evasion, it's tax avoidance.
Tax avoidance.
Just a moment,
Just
before you misrepresent something and mislead the audience, you're talking about, in fact, deliberate policies of tax reduction and avoidance to encourage entrepreneurship, to encourage employment, to encourage productivity. If that didn't happen, half the growth that you see would also be lost. So when you call it tax evasion, A, you're wrong in terminology, and B, you're ignoring the very important byproduct of growth that emerges from it. Give the full picture.
Yes, you can. Keep it brief.
Whether you call it the fact that you're giving tax SOPs to encourage growth, that's wonderful, and we must get that. But if in the same breath you say that you can afford to give tax SOPs in 5 trillion and you can't afford a food security bill, I don't agree. But much more importantly is what Karan was speaking about enabling entrepreneurship, and I completely agree with that. The problem, Tony, is that both governments, whether it was BJP-led or Congress-led, has been focusing on, and when Karan speaks or Swapan speaks, we're talking about 6% of this economy. 94% of this economy is not part of the national conversation.
Okay.
When you speak of labor, they're not part of this conversation. So, Tony, may I just finish?
This is a myth to suggest that
it is a myth to suggest I'm going to call a halt to this discussion because you've got an election coming up next year.
And
your next question is from
Tony,
Joy
may I finish making this point?
You can do it in 10 seconds.
That I would love it if the governments enabled small entrepreneurs, because definitely what Karan is saying is true. We want more entrepreneurship in this country. We need all the 80% that are not part of this conversation to be entrepreneurs.
Okay.
And I don't think we are discussing them. So I'm not left of center. I'm saying, of course.
You're far left of center.
All right, one of the interesting things for Australian audience listening to this is the echoes of similar arguments that we're having in our own country. Our next question is from Ajoy Roy.
Well, India with its emerging youth is poised to be one of the biggest economic superpowers by around 2020 and beyond. India knows it, the world is anticipating it, and the non-resident Indians, many of them, are considering returning back to India. In view of this, and in the context of the forthcoming elections, what does this panel know about the credentials of Mr. Rahul Gandhi and Mr. Narendra Modi, and its implications for the people of India and Australia if one of them is elected as the next Prime Minister?
Okay, let's start with Shwapan Dasgupta, because I think it's known that you are generally a supporter of Narendra Modi. And perhaps you need to explain who he is to an Australian audience.
Well, he's been the chief minister of a province in Western India for the past 12 years.
A state, Shobha, not a province.
Well, a state, okay? I was using Australian analogies.
No, we have states too.
We played a state game. Sorry about that.
But that's all right.
Now,
I think this disregard for historical facts that Narendra Modi shows every day
I think,
has
you know,
rubbed off on his fans.
Ding, 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 ding. Round two.
I think there has been a degree of supreme condescension and conceit from the entrenched intellectual classes, very much like we saw in Australia some time ago, about a person who's come in, who is outside the beltway, as it were. The point about
Who's the
Narendra
person
Modi,
in Australia you're referring to?
I'm looking at Tony Abbott, the manner in which he was decried by the aesthetes in Australia for the manner in which he articulated his politics.
Okay, so for the Australian audience, you're suggesting that Narendra Modi is a kind of Indian Tony Abbott, are you?
I think there could be similarities. I think there could be a lot of similarities. I think emphasis on high growth, emphasis on minimal government, emphasis on building up skills of Indians, and most important, I think, emphasis on a determined and honest leadership. These are the qualities which mark Narendra Modi, and which is what is resonating across the country, and which is why he is a favorite to win this election.
Shwapan, I'm not a part of this Indian election, clearly, but I can guarantee you that if Tony Abbott had been allegedly a part of something that happened on the trains in India 3 years ago, he would not have been allowed to progress through the election campaign without saying sorry. Without saying sorry.
I think we're talking about something that happened not 3 years ago, but back in 2002.
Well, 2002. I'm very sorry, but look.
And it wasn't on the trains; it was in response to something that happened on the trains. But let's not.
But Tony, you can't go criticising our Prime Minister and comparing him to a man that has been involved in something that was really quite offensive. To a big part of your population.
Tony, something that I think your audience in Australia needs to appreciate and understand is that there are many, many Indians who look at the two contenders and say to themselves, can a country of 1.2 billion not put up people more deserving of being Prime Minister? The truth of the matter is, neither of them, frankly, deserves to be the next Prime Minister of India. Narendra Modi has obvious failings, which I'm not going to go into because I think they're too well known and it would be boring to discuss them, but clearly he carries...
They're not well known, they're not actually well known to the Australian audience. If he were to become Prime Minister, there is the question that Stuart was just talking about is about something that happened in 2002.
No, it's the moral responsibility that he carries.
In response to Mujahideen killing Hindus on a train.
A
lot of Muslims were killed in Gujarat, in his province. And the question is, did he have anything to do with that? Did he turn a blind eye to those sectarian killings in Gujarat?
The truth is this. He is morally responsible as Chief Minister for what happens in the state in three senses. One, it shouldn't have happened. If it has and a riot's taken place, the responsibility and the buck stops with him. Two, the manner in which you respond to it when it happens. And three, the steps you take thereafter to rehabilitate those who are victims. On all three counts, he's been found wanting. The Supreme Court has gone on record in April 2004 in a specific judgment. It wasn't just a comment made in court to call him and his government modern-day Neros who deliberately chose. It was not. Forgive me. April the 12th.
It was not a judgment.
Forgive me. It was
Karan, it was not a judgment.
It was.
It was a stray comment
Forgive
of a
me.
judge.
April the 12th, 2004. The Zahira Sheikh judgment in the Best Bakery case. I assure you, I'm right.
I assure you, Karan,
after
you're wrong.
the show is over, I'll send you the judgment. I'll send you the judgment after the show is over. The judgment referred to the Modi government as modern-day Neros who deliberately chose to look the other way, as helpless children and innocent women burnt to death. And there's a lot more they said as well. But that moral weight he carries still. And if tomorrow when he's Prime Minister there were to be a communal riot somewhere else, with what credibility could he say to a chief minister of another state, you need to step in and make sure this doesn't happen because he failed when it was his turn?
Okay, we need to get Shwapan to respond to that, then I'll come to Shoma. Go ahead.
I think it's fair to say that Mr. Modi has moral owes moral responsibility for what happened in 2002. I think that's a very fair comment to make, and it also suggests there was an administrative lapse. However, to suggest that he should be disqualified from politics as a result of that, and therefore to imply that there was a sort of criminal conspiracy in which he participated in, I think is stretching the point too far.
I agree.
I would say that had such been the case, then I think we would certainly have ruled out Rajiv Gandhi as a prime minister of this country, because it was under his watch that certain horrific things happened in the aftermath of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination.
All right, we're close to running out of time.
I think it's important to note that what happened in 2002 has never been repeated in Gujarat and is unlikely to ever be repeated in India. And I think the lessons of 2002 have been internalized by the entire political system, and it's best to look forward rather than look back.
Okay, Sherman.
I think
A brief answer, I'm sorry, because we're running out of time.
Swapan is right, but I'm tired of the moral equivalences we keep making, that because the Congress screwed up in 1984, that it's okay to do so in 2002. And Swapan seems to have really short-term memory, because it's barely a few months old that we've had the Muzaffarnagar riots, in which not only the SP and the Congress, but the BJP had a huge hand to play in.
Really?
And unfortunately...
Really?
Yes. I mean...
Really? I mean,
Swapan, do you not know?
You are
Swapan,
really
I said the Congress,
this is
the
wonderful.
SP,
The point is, it's an SP government.
Swapan,
where do you bring Mr. Modi into the
Swapan,
picture?
did I mention Mr. Modi?
You
I
brought
said
the BJP into the picture.
Are you unaware of the fact?
Completely unaware. Yes, I am unaware.
Ladies
Swapan,
and
may I
gentlemen, I'm just going to give...
Tony, no, may I finish making the point?
Yes, okay, if you're quick.
I'm really sorry if a public commentator like Swapan is unaware that both SP and Congress, BJP ministers and MLAs had a role to play in those riots. There was a BJP MLA that actually put out an extremely egregious and false piece of video which created a lot of tension in that place. And the fact that the top leadership has not seen fit to criticize his actions is appalling. And that's true of the Congress and the SP as well.
All right.
So I just want to say, I want to reiterate what Karan said. We are a benighted nation if today we are left with Narendra Modi and Rahul Gandhi as the top contenders for Prime Minister.
Well, we need to say, Swapan, we actually need to hear from Shashi.
We don't run a presidential system here, we run a parliamentary system. Parties in our country will be voted for. Who they choose as their leaders is up to them. The BJP has chosen Mr. Modi. We, as far as we're concerned, we're running on a platform, a record of governance, as well as a set of values which we believe are closer to the values of most Indians than Mr. Modi's values. Second, in our country, whether we grow at 6% or 9%, or less, as we now are, very frankly, we have to worry about the bottom 25% of our society. Congress Party does, Mr. Modi doesn't. And I think that's, again, an important difference we need to put across. Rahul Gandhi does stand for the dispossessed, for his concerns for the poor and the underprivileged in our society. Third, there is an idea of India, whether you like it or not. It's not an elite affectation. It's an idea of India as a land for people of every background, every religion, every caste, creed, color, language, dress, food habits. That India is a capacious India. It's an India that incorporates everyone, where everyone has equal rights, equal beliefs, equal authority, equal duties. Congress stands for that. Mr. Modi does not. He stands for a much more narrow sectarian vision, as his repeated statements, pronouncements, and conduct have demonstrated. So I believe there is a choice. And to reduce it to merely two individuals is not right. We have to look at what exactly we want our country to be all about. And I believe that when we come to the ballot boxes in the end, our nation will stand for the India that they cherish, and not for the kinds of claims that we've made on this panel today on behalf of some.
I'm sorry to say it's a lot. No, sorry.
That we also will decide whether we stand for a government that is passed on by inheritance or a government which is passed on by merit.
Okay, that is all we have time for tonight. I'm sorry to say we're a live program and we're out of time. In preparing for this program, I did read a book called The Argumentative Indian, and I think we've just seen some evidence that that is in a true description of the country. Please thank our panel, Karan Thapa, Shashi Tharoor, Pallavi Sharda, Shomi Chowdhury, and Swapan Gupta and Stuart McGill.